The owner thinks the horse is throwing the race until the horse sees a girl and loses his mind trying to reach her. 10 seconds later, they vanish through a half-open gate. But the real twist isn't the escape. It's the reason the horse recognized her at all. The grandstands were full before noon. Sunlight flashed across sunglasses, camera lenses, and the giant betting board above the track. Numbers kept changing. Voices kept rising. Dust drifted through the hot air. It was the biggest race day of the year, and every face in that place seemed hungry for the same thing. A winner. Down by the paddock, Chuck Danner stood with one hand locked around the rail, watching the horse that carried everything he still hoped to become. Pegasus. A black thoroughbred with a reputation sharp enough to cut through any room. Powerful, fast, unpredictable. The kind of horse that could make a poor man look important in a single afternoon. Chuck had bet his entire future on him. Loans, promises, mortgaged land, deals made with people who never accepted excuses. If Pegasus won today, Chuck's life changed. If he lost, everything Chuck had built would start collapsing at once. That was why the first sound felt so wrong. A violent clang of metal. Then another. Chuck's eyes snapped up. Pegasus reared high in the paddock, front legs slicing the air. The lead rope jerked hard, burned through a handler's grip, and snapped loose. The gate slammed against the railing with a scream of steel. A jockey stumbled backward and hit the dirt. Another handler barely avoided a flying hoof. In 1 second, the horse turned from prized contender into public disaster. Pegasus came down hard, nostrils wide, muscles jumping under his dark coat. He spun once, slammed the side gate, and threw his head so violently the bridle rang against metal. His eyes were wide with something deeper than anger. Not defiance. Panic. The crowd smelled blood instantly. "Scratch him," someone shouted. A few rival owners laughed openly. One sponsor stepped back with disgust written all over his face. A steward reached for his radio. Even the announcer's voice faltered, as if the script of the day had just been torn in half. Chuck felt his throat tighten. Not today, not now. He swallowed hard, jaw locked so tight it hurt. "Please," he whispered, too low for anyone but himself to hear. "Not today." But Pegasus only grew worse. Another metallic snap echoed from the paddock latch, and the horse flinched like the sound had struck an old wound buried somewhere no one could see. He lunged again. People scattered. Security began pushing through the crowd, but the panic was spreading faster than order. Then, in the middle of all that noise, someone walked past. A girl in plain clothes. No badge, no racing silks, no reason to matter. Leslie Ward was just trying to cross behind the paddock, head slightly down, moving like someone used to being ignored. Jeans, faded shirt, dust on her boots. Nothing about her belonged to the grand spectacle around her. Then Pegasus saw her. The change was instant. His whole body locked. The wild, desperate movement stopped as if a hidden hand had pressed stillness into his bones. His ears turned forward. His neck lowered by inches. His breathing, which had been coming in sharp bursts, began to slow. Around him, people froze. Leslie stopped too. She looked at Pegasus with the stunned, aching expression of someone seeing a ghost step out of the past. She did not rush him. She did not speak loudly. She simply lifted one hand. When her palm touched the side of his face, the paddock seemed to fall into a strange silence. Pegasus bowed his head. Not because he was beaten, because he knew her. A long breath left his body. The trembling in his legs eased. He leaned into her touch with a softness that made the last 30 seconds feel impossible. Chuck stared in disbelief. The same horse that had nearly torn the paddock apart now stood like an animal listening to an old song only he could hear. Leslie whispered something near his cheek. No one caught the words. Pegasus moved first. He turned toward the rear service lane behind the paddock. At that exact moment, a hay delivery truck had just passed through the back gate. The metal gate was still swinging, not fully closed. Security was focused on the main chaos. For a few seconds, no one blocked the opening. Pegasus surged. Leslie grabbed the halter strap on instinct and was pulled upward with him, half climbing, half falling against his back. There was no saddle, no graceful escape, only momentum, fear, and something that looked bigger than both. They shot through the half-open gate. By the time security understood what was happening, Pegasus was already in the service lane. A second later, he vanished into the tree-lined trail behind the racetrack, carrying Leslie with him like he was running toward memory instead of away from danger. The crowd erupted. Shouts, radios, confusion, questions. But Chuck did not move. He stood there, staring at the empty gate, while the truth began forming inside him like a storm he could no longer outrun. Pegasus had not gone mad. He had recognized someone. And for the first time, Chuck felt a question rise that money, training, and ownership had never forced him to ask. What had Pegasus lost before he ever belonged to him? By the time the shouting settled into angry murmurs, Pegasus was already miles away in the minds of everyone at the racetrack. Not physically, perhaps. No one knew exactly how far he had run. But in the brutal theater of public judgment, the story had already escaped the paddock and begun galloping through the crowd. The service gate behind the paddock still swayed slightly on its hinge, tapping metal against metal in the warm afternoon air. Dust hung in the lane where hooves had thundered only moments earlier. Beyond the fence line, the narrow trail disappeared into a wall of trees. That small opening had lasted less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds. Long enough for a lifetime of plans to vanish. Chuck Danner stood frozen beside the rail, staring at the empty lane as if the horse might somehow come running back once the noise faded. But the noise did not fade. The announcer recovered first, his voice forcing its way back through the speakers with professional calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay while officials secure the paddock area." A brief delay. The crowd responded the way crowds always did. First confusion, then excitement, and finally judgment. People leaned over the rails with their phones raised. Conversations exploded in every direction. "Did you see that girl? That horse went crazy. They're going to scratch him. Owner just lost a fortune." Chuck could feel the words circling him like vultures. He stepped away from the paddock and moved through the stable corridor without speaking. A few officials tried to stop him, but his expression warned them off. Stable hands stared as he passed, some curious, some sympathetic, others already calculating how quickly this disaster would spread through the racing circuit. Inside the barn office, the world looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Neat, precise, controlled. On the wall hung laminated training charts marked with red and blue ink. Gallop intervals. Heart rate recovery times. Feed schedules measured to the ounce. A clipboard with race projections sat beside a laptop showing sponsor commitments. Everything in that room had been built around one assumption: Pegasus would win. Chuck walked to the desk slowly, as if he were entering the ruins of something sacred. His fingers brushed across the stopwatches lying beside the ledger. 3 identical timers, lined up in perfect order. The tools of a man who believed time itself could be disciplined. His phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name he had expected: Margot Klein. Chuck hesitated before opening the message. Margot wasn't just a lender. She was the investor who had made Pegasus possible: equipment, trainers, transport fees, entry rights. Her money sat underneath every board in this barn. The text contained only one line: "You lose Pegasus, you lose everything." Chuck stared at the words until the screen dimmed. Lose Pegasus. The phrase sounded simple, almost administrative, like misplacing cargo. But that wasn't what had happened. Pegasus hadn't been lost. Pegasus had chosen. Boots sounded behind him. Coach Rivas stepped into the office doorway, arms folded across his chest. He was an older man with the quiet authority that came from decades around animals that weighed half a ton and trusted very little. "You saw it," Rivas said. Chuck didn't answer. Rivas continued anyway. "I told you last week he was riding the edge." Chuck rubbed his temples. "You said he was restless." "I said he was overworked." Chuck finally looked up. He was fine in training. Rivas shook his head slowly. "No, he was obedient in training. That's not the same thing." Silence settled between them. Outside, the racetrack roared again as another race began. The thunder of hooves rolled through the barn like distant artillery. For a moment, Chuck imagined Pegasus out there again, strong, fast, unstoppable. But the stall where Pegasus belonged was empty. Chuck left the office and walked down the aisle. The stall door hung open. Inside, the aftermath of the paddock chaos was visible in every corner. The water bucket lay tipped sideways, straw soaked beneath it. The bedding had been kicked apart. A leather strap had snapped during the struggle and now hung loose from the rail. Chuck stepped into the stall slowly. The smell of sweat and hay lingered in the air. He crouched and picked up the broken lead rope. The fibers were frayed and stiff with dried sweat, evidence of force, evidence of resistance. For months, Chuck had convinced himself Pegasus's silence meant discipline. But silence could mean many things. A memory rose uninvited. Chuck, as a boy, standing beside his father in a small barn that smelled of rain and wood shavings. His father's hand rested gently on the neck of an old gelding. "Horses remember more than people think," the old man had said. Chuck had laughed at the time. Back then, horses were just animals. Tools for work, tools for racing, tools for winning. Now, the memory felt different. He placed the rope on the rail and noticed something lying on the cabinet outside the stall. A photo frame. It had fallen face down during the chaos. Chuck picked it up. The picture showed him years earlier beside his father, both standing beside a calm bay horse. His father's expression was peaceful, almost proud. Chuck looked younger, eager, convinced the world would eventually bend toward his ambition. His father had believed in patience. Chuck believed in pressure. Behind him, Rivas leaned against the doorway. "You going to report the horse?" he asked. Chuck nodded slowly. "Yes." Rivas didn't argue, because both men knew this was no longer just about an animal. Sponsors would demand answers. Investors would demand repayment. News from a racetrack spread faster than wildfire. By nightfall, the story would already be moving through every stable in 3 states. Chuck pulled out his phone again. Calling the authorities felt like grabbing the last remaining thread of control. He gave them the facts. A horse, a young woman, direction of travel, possible theft. His voice sounded steady, even calm. But when the call ended and the aisle fell silent again, the truth returned like a weight pressing down on his chest. He stepped once more into Pegasus's empty stall. For the first time since the escape, he looked at the space not as an owner, but as a man confronting something he had never tried to understand. The horse hadn't been wild. He hadn't been defiant. He had been afraid. Chuck stared into the stall and felt a question rise slowly, painfully, like something long buried pushing toward the light. A question he had never once asked. Not during the training, not during the races, not during the months he had called Pegasus his investment. What had Pegasus survived? Before he ever met me. The sheriff's cruiser arrived just as the afternoon heat began settling over the racetrack like a heavy blanket. Dust rolled slowly across the parking lot. Vendors were still shouting near the grandstand. Somewhere in the distance, another race had begun. The thunder of hooves echoing through loudspeakers like nothing unusual had happened at all. But inside the stable corridor, the atmosphere had changed. A quiet tension lived there now, the kind that follows an event no one fully understands. Chuck Danner stood near the entrance of the barn, arms folded, jaw tight, watching the cruiser pull to a stop. The driver's door opened. Deputy Nina Park stepped out. She wasn't what the racetrack crowd expected when they heard the word deputy. No dramatic swagger, no raised voice. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone used to arriving after chaos had already done its work. Early 30s, dark hair tied back, a pair of thoughtful eyes that seemed to measure more than they revealed. She took one look at the paddock area, the broken latch on the gate, the scattered handlers still replaying the event in loud voices, and then she turned toward Chuck. "You the owner?" she asked. Chuck nodded. "Chuck Danner." Nina stepped closer, scanning the scene with quick, practiced glances. Her attention moved across the damaged rail, the trampled dirt, the broken lead rope now hanging over the fence. "Horse name?" "Pegasus." "And the girl?" Chuck hesitated. That moment bothered him more than he expected. "I don't know," he admitted. "Never seen her before." Nina didn't write anything yet. She simply watched him for a second longer than most people did. "Walk me through it," she said. Chuck explained. The paddock, the panic, the horse rearing, the moment the girl stepped in, the sudden calm, the escape through the service gate. He spoke clearly, keeping his voice even, the way a man does when he wants the facts to stand between him and everything else. But the more he described it, the stranger the story sounded. Nina listened without interrupting. When he finished, she glanced toward the rear service lane. "Mind showing me where they exited?" Chuck led her past the paddock fence. The gate was still slightly open, its metal hinge creaking softly whenever the breeze pushed it. Beyond it, a dirt service lane curved toward the outer boundary of the track. At the far end, the land dipped into a narrow trail lined with trees. Nina crouched near the ground. Hoof prints were still visible in the dust. Fresh, fast, deep. She followed them with her eyes until they disappeared into the tree line. "Horse wasn't running blind," she said quietly. Chuck frowned. "What do you mean?" "Look at the tracks." She pointed. The hoof marks were straight, direct, not the scattered pattern of a panicked animal fleeing randomly. "He knew where he was going," she said. Chuck crossed his arms again. "He was out of control." Nina stood slowly. "Out of control, horses don't pick exit routes." The words hung between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Behind them, the racetrack loudspeakers erupted again with cheers as another race finished. The sound felt strangely distant now. Nina turned back toward the paddock. "You said the horse calmed down when he saw her." "Yes." "How close was she when that happened?" 10 feet, maybe." "And he stopped immediately." Chuck nodded, like someone flipped a switch. Nina studied him carefully. "You sure she didn't have a lead rope? Or some kind of training signal?" "No." "Food?" Chuck shook his head again. "She just touched him." Nina let that settle. Then she asked the question Chuck had been avoiding. "How long have you owned Pegasus?" "Almost a year." "And before that?" Chuck shrugged. "Bought him through a broker, racing circuit acquisition." "From where, originally?"
Unchained is trying
"Don't
to
know."
disguise.
That answer made Nina tilt her head slightly. "You bought a high-performance racehorse and never looked at the early ownership records?" Chuck felt irritation rise in his chest. "That's not unusual." "Maybe not." Nina walked a few steps toward the stall barn. But animals remember things people forget to document. Chuck followed her down the aisle. When they reached Pegasus's stall, Nina paused in the doorway. She looked at the torn bedding, the overturned bucket, the scrape marks along the wooden wall. She ran her fingers across one of the grooves where Pegasus had struck the boards earlier. Then she stepped back and examined the stall from a different angle. "Something scared him," she said. Chuck shook his head. "He's raced in bigger crowds than today." "Crowds aren't the same as triggers." She pointed toward the metal latch hanging from the gate. "That sound earlier, when the latch snapped." Chuck remembered the moment. The sharp, metallic crack. Pegasus flinching like lightning had touched him. Nina noticed the memory cross his face. "You saw it too," she said. Chuck didn't respond. Nina straightened and folded her notebook closed. "I'll put out a notice," she said. Horse that size won't be easy to hide. Chuck nodded slowly. Good. But Nina wasn't finished. She walked a few steps toward the barn exit and then stopped. One more thing, she said. Chuck looked up. If this was a theft, she continued, that girl would have run the second your horse calmed down. Chuck frowned. What are you getting at? Nina turned toward the trail beyond the service gate again. Her voice was quieter now. That didn't look like stealing. The words sat heavy in the barn. Chuck felt his chest tighten again. Then what did it look like? He asked. Nina held his gaze for a long moment. Then she gave the only answer that made the entire afternoon suddenly feel different. This, she said softly, looked like a reunion. The racetrack looked different after sunset. Without the roar of the crowd, it felt hollow. The grandstand stood empty like abandoned scaffolding. Paper cups rolled across the concrete in the evening wind. The giant betting board had gone dark, its bright numbers replaced by a cold black screen. What remained was the quiet skeleton of a place that had fed all afternoon on ambition. Inside the barn office, the lights buzzed faintly overhead. Chuck Danner sat at his desk with the folder open in front of him, staring at paperwork that suddenly felt incomplete in ways he had never noticed before. Deputy Nina Park stood near the wall, studying the training charts that covered it. Timed gallops, heart rate recovery logs, speed measurements written down to the ounce. Everything about the room showed discipline, control, precision. You track everything, Nina said. Chuck didn't look up. That's how racing works. She nodded slowly. Yes, racing. The way she said the word made something tighten in Chuck's chest. Because racing was only the middle of a horse's life, not the beginning, and not the reason Pegasus had dropped his head into a stranger's hand like he had been waiting for her. Chuck closed the folder halfway and stood. Come with me. He walked into the narrow storage room beside the office and pulled the light chain. A single bulb flickered on, revealing shelves filled with old equipment and stacked cardboard boxes. This was where the forgotten things lived. Early paperwork, old tack, records that stopped being useful once the horse started winning. Chuck crouched and dragged the nearest box onto the floor. Dust lifted into the air as he opened it. Vaccination slips, shipping receipts, farrier invoices, nothing from before Pegasus entered the racing circuit. He pushed the box aside and opened another. More paperwork, more numbers, more documents about performance and money and schedules. Still nothing about where Pegasus had actually come from. Behind him, Nina waited quietly. She wasn't rushing him. That made the silence heavier. Chuck opened a third box. This one held a thick manila file with Pegasus written across the tab in black marker. He recognized it immediately. The original purchase file. He carried it back into the office and dropped it onto the desk. The papers inside were exactly what he remembered signing months earlier. Purchase agreement, veterinary clearance, transport approval, broker authorization. Everything that proved Pegasus legally belonged to him. Chuck flipped through the pages until he reached the ownership chain. And then he stopped. There was a gap. The document listed the broker who sold Pegasus to Chuck. It listed the transfer into Chuck's stable. It listed the registration once Pegasus entered training. But the earliest record, the farm where the horse had been born, was missing. In its place sat a single short line. Prior private transfer. Details unavailable. Chuck read it again. Unavailable. He felt a slow uneasiness spread through him. He had spent months studying Pegasus's stride and stamina with near obsession. But he had never questioned this missing piece, because at the time the past had not mattered. Only the future. Your broker filled this out? Nina asked. Chuck nodded. Nolan Pierce. Did you ever ask where Pegasus came from originally? Chuck shook his head once. No. Nina didn't judge him. She only said, animals don't erase their past just because paperwork does. A sound came from the hallway, boots on wood. Chuck turned. Jack Malloy stood in the doorway holding his cap in both hands. He looked uncomfortable, like a man unsure if he should be speaking at all. "Sorry," Jack said. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Chuck straightened. "What is it?" Jack stepped inside slowly. "I kept thinking about what happened in the paddock." Chuck sighed quietly. "A lot of people are." Jack nodded. "Yeah, but not everybody noticed the mark." Nina's attention sharpened immediately. "What mark?" Jack pointed toward his own shoulder. "When Pegasus reared up, his left shoulder showed for a second. There's a scar there, curved shape, like a half moon with a small split through it." Chuck frowned. "I've seen the scar." Jack shook his head gently. "I knew a scar like that once." The room went still. Jack rubbed the back of his neck, searching his memory. "Years ago, I worked a farm near the county line. Small place, family trying to keep things afloat. Their mare had a rough foaling. Real rough. The foal got stuck, and they had to pull hard to save him." He paused. "Left a mark in almost that exact spot." Chuck felt something shift in his chest. "You're saying Pegasus came from that farm?" Jack raised one hand carefully. "I'm not saying it's proof. Just saying I recognize the mark." Nina asked quietly, "Do you remember the family name?" Jack hesitated. Then he said it. "Ward." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into deep water. Chuck felt the air leave his lungs. Ward. Leslie Ward. The girl from the racetrack. The girl Pegasus had chosen. Jack spoke again, almost apologetically. "If that mark means what I think it means, you might want to find out who raised that horse." Nina was already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the county registry," she said. "If the foal was recorded properly, they'll have something." She stepped into the hallway. Chuck remained where he stood, staring at the open folder on his desk. The missing early record, the broker's signature, the careful legal structure that had convinced him Pegasus was simply a purchase. From the hallway, Nina's voice carried softly as she spoke to someone on the phone. Registration number, physical identifier, shoulder scar, property records. The office felt smaller with every passing second. Jack shifted quietly near the door. "You all right?" he asked. Chuck didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure. A few minutes later, Nina returned. Her expression had changed. Not shocked, certain. "There's a match," she said. Chuck looked up slowly. Nina glanced at her notes. Archived full registration. Black colt. Birth complication listed. Shoulder scar recorded during assisted delivery. Chuck swallowed. "And the owner?" Nina met his eyes. "The property is registered to a family outside Mill Creek." She paused. "The name is Ward." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The events of the day rearranged themselves in Chuck's mind. The chaos, the sudden calm, the way Pegasus had lowered his head when Leslie touched him. Not obedience, recognition. Chuck sat down slowly. If the record was true, the girl at the racetrack hadn't taken Pegasus. She had found him. Nina closed her notebook. "If Leslie Ward is who the records say she is," she said quietly, "then this didn't start today." Chuck stared at the folder. "No." Nina stepped toward the door. "Then we should go find her. Because somewhere beyond the county road, beyond the trees Pegasus had disappeared into, the beginning of the story was waiting." Night had already settled across the county road by the time the cruiser left the racetrack behind. The bright noise of the fairgrounds faded quickly in the rearview mirror, replaced by long stretches of quiet farmland and narrow two-lane pavement cutting through dark fields. The sky had turned a deep shade of blue that lived somewhere between evening and true night. Wind moved slowly across the roadside grass. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Deputy Nina Park drove. Chuck sat in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at the road unwinding ahead of them. Neither of them had spoken much since leaving the track. The address Nina had pulled from the county registry led them farther and farther away from the lights of town. The pavement eventually gave way to rougher asphalt and then to a gravel road that curved through scattered trees and aging fence posts. The place felt forgotten. Chuck leaned forward slightly when the cruiser headlights caught the outline of an old wooden sign half hidden by weeds. Mill Creek Road. Nina slowed the vehicle. "Farm should be another mile," she said. The gravel crunched softly beneath the tires as they continued deeper into the dark. Chuck felt the strange tension of approaching something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. If the registry was right, if Jack's memory was right, if Pegasus had truly come from here, then the girl at the racetrack had not been a stranger, and everything Chuck had called ownership might suddenly become something else entirely. The road ended at a rusted gate. Beyond it stood a small property that looked as though time had simply stopped visiting. A leaning wooden fence surrounded a wide patch of dry pasture. An old barn sat to one side with weather-beaten boards and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The farmhouse itself was small, one story, with a dim yellow porch light glowing weakly against the darkness. Nina turned off the cruiser engine. The sudden silence was heavy. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Chuck saw something shift near the barn. A dark shape, tall, familiar. His chest tightened. Pegasus. The horse stood quietly beside the barn fence, head lowered, his dark coat catching the faint glow from the porch light. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't restless. He looked calm, like he had arrived somewhere that made sense. Chuck stepped out of the cruiser slowly. Gravel crunched under his boots. Pegasus lifted his head. For a brief second, Chuck wondered if the horse might bolt again. But Pegasus didn't move. Instead, another figure stepped forward from the shadows near the barn. Leslie. She had both arms wrapped around Pegasus's neck, her face pressed gently against the horse's shoulder. One hand moved slowly along his mane, the same quiet motion she had used in the paddock earlier that day. She looked tired. Dust covered her jeans. Strands of hair had slipped loose around her face, but the expression in her eyes was not fear. It was relief. Chuck stopped walking. The sight in front of him didn't look like a thief caught with stolen property. It looked like someone who had finally found something she thought she had lost forever. Deputy Nina stepped forward beside him. "Leslie Ward?" she called calmly. Leslie turned. For a second, panic flickered across her face. Her arms tightened slightly around Pegasus's neck, as if she expected someone to try pulling him away again. But Nina raised one hand in a gentle, steady gesture. "Easy," she said. "No one's here to hurt the horse." Pegasus watched the three humans carefully. His ears flicked once toward Chuck, then back toward Leslie. Chuck noticed the small movement immediately, and something about it hurt more than he expected. Leslie stepped away from the barn light slowly, though one hand never left Pegasus's mane. "You followed me," she said quietly. Nina nodded. "We followed the records." Leslie glanced once at Chuck. There was no anger in her eyes, only something sadder. "You checked the registry," she said. Chuck didn't answer, because the truth was written all over his face. Leslie looked back at Pegasus and ran her fingers through his mane again. "He remembered the way home," she whispered. Chuck felt those words hit him like a weight. Nina spoke carefully. "Leslie." Chuck reported the horse missing. Leslie gave a faint nod. "I figured. You understand why we had to come check?" "I do." For a moment, the only sound was the soft rustle of wind moving through the pasture grass. Then another engine sound approached from the road behind them. Headlights cut through the darkness. A pickup truck rolled up beside the gate and stopped. Chuck turned. A tall man stepped out. Expensive boots, clean jacket, confident smile that never quite reached his eyes. Chuck recognized him instantly. Nolan Pierce, the broker. Pierce leaned casually against the truck door, surveying the scene like a man arriving just in time for business. "Well," he said smoothly, "looks like everyone found what they were looking for." Leslie stiffened. Pegasus shifted his weight uneasily. Chuck's stomach tightened. Pierce glanced at the horse with open interest. "Beautiful animal," he said. "Worth quite a bit more now than when I first handled the paperwork." Nina stepped forward slightly. "And why exactly are you here tonight, Mr. Pierce?" Pierce shrugged. "Heard about the little incident at the track. Word travels fast in the horse world." His eyes moved toward Pegasus again, then toward Leslie. "And I figured if the horse ran somewhere, it might be here." Leslie's voice hardened. "You shouldn't be here." Pierce smiled faintly. "Actually," he said, "if we're discussing ownership, I might have more right to be here than anyone." Chuck felt anger rise instantly. "What are you talking about?" Pierce pushed himself off the truck door and stepped closer to the fence. "The early transfer paperwork," he said casually. "The one your deputy friend probably noticed was missing a few details." Chuck's hands clenched. Pierce looked at Leslie again. "Funny thing about horses," he continued. "Sometimes debts move faster than love." Pegasus suddenly tossed his head once, ears flattening slightly. The tension in the air changed, and for the first time that night, Chuck realized something dangerous was beginning to unfold. Because this confrontation was no longer about a missing horse. It was about who had the right to decide what Pegasus's life would become. For a moment, no one moved. The wind slid slowly across the empty pasture, brushing through the tall grass and rattling the loose tin along the barn roof. The faint porch light from the farmhouse spilled across the ground in a thin yellow circle, barely strong enough to push back the darkness gathered around the property. Pegasus stood at the center of it all. One ear turned toward Leslie, the other flicked toward the men at the gate. Animals understood tension long before humans admitted it. Nolan Pierce rested his arms casually along the top rail of the fence as if he were leaning into a friendly business conversation. But his eyes never left the horse. "That's quite an animal," he said smoothly. "Even better than when I arranged the sale." Chuck felt something tighten in his chest. "You arranged paperwork," Chuck replied. "You didn't raise him." Pierce smiled faintly. "Raising and selling are two different businesses." Leslie stepped forward then, her hand still resting against Pegasus's neck. The horse lowered his head slightly, breathing slow and steady, as if her presence anchored him to the ground. "You already took him once," she said quietly. Pierce's smile thinned. "Your father owed money." "That doesn't make him yours. That makes him collateral." The word landed hard in the night air. Deputy Nina Park stepped closer to the fence. "Mr. Pierce," she said calmly, "this isn't the place for private debt collection." Pierce gave a small shrug. "I'm not collecting anything tonight, Deputy. I'm simply observing a situation involving a horse I once transferred legally." Chuck stepped forward. "You transferred him to me." Pierce tilted his head slightly. "Yes, but that doesn't erase the chain behind the transfer." The words hung between them like smoke. Chuck could feel Leslie tense beside Pegasus. Pierce noticed it too. "You see," Pierce continued, his voice smooth as polished glass, "when a family falls behind on payments, assets move. Sometimes those assets happen to have 4 legs." Leslie's hand tightened slightly in Pegasus's mane. "That's not how it happened," she said. Pierce laughed softly. "Isn't it?" For the first time since arriving, Nina's voice carried an edge. "Mr. Pierce," Pierce looked at her. "If you have documentation that changes the legal ownership of this horse tonight, you can present it to the county office tomorrow morning." He spread his hands casually. "Until then, I'm just standing on a public road." Nina held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Good. Then you'll also understand why no one is taking that horse anywhere tonight." Pierce didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past Nina, toward Pegasus. The horse had shifted his weight slightly. not nervously, protectively, his body angled toward Leslie. Chuck noticed the change. So did Pierce. Interesting, Pierce murmured. Looks like he still remembers. Leslie's voice dropped. Of course he does. Pierce studied her face. You ran after the trailer that day, didn't you? The words froze the air. Chuck felt a small chill move along his spine. Leslie didn't answer right away. The memory had already arrived in her eyes. It was raining, Pierce continued calmly. Your father was shouting. The bank papers had already been signed. Leslie looked down. I was 10. Pierce nodded. You kept running down the road even after the truck turned the corner. Chuck looked at her, stunned. Leslie's fingers moved slowly through Pegasus's mane. I thought if he heard my voice, he might come back. The quiet truth in her voice carried more weight than any argument. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Pierce seemed to pause, though only briefly. Then the old rhythm of business returned to his expression. Well, he said lightly, memories are touching things. Unfortunately, they don't override contracts. Chuck felt something inside him shift. For the first time that night, he looked at Pegasus not as an investment or a racing prospect, but as an animal standing between two pasts, one built on debt, one built on love. Pegasus lifted his head and looked directly at Chuck. There was no fear in the horse's eyes now, only awareness, as if he were waiting. Chuck exhaled slowly. Then he spoke. Deputy. Nina glanced at him. I'm withdrawing the theft report. Pierce straightened. That's a generous move. Chuck ignored him. Nina studied Chuck carefully. You're sure? Chuck nodded. Yes. He looked at Leslie. If Pegasus came here on his own, then tonight he stays here. The relief in Leslie's face was immediate, though she tried to hide it. Pierce, however, did not look pleased. You're walking away from a very expensive animal, he said. Chuck met his gaze. No. He paused. I'm finally looking at him. The sentence settled into the quiet night like something new. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Nina took a small step back. All right, she said. Temporary hold until ownership records are reviewed. Pierce gave a small sigh. Well, I suppose we'll let the lawyers untangle the rest. He turned and walked back toward his truck. Before climbing in, he glanced once more at Pegasus. Enjoy the reunion, he said. The truck engine started. Headlights swept briefly across the pasture, then faded as the vehicle disappeared down the dark road. Silence returned to the farm. Real silence. Chuck stood near the gate for a long moment. Leslie leaned gently against Pegasus again, her forehead resting against the horse's shoulder. The animal breathed slowly, completely calm now, as if the long run from the racetrack had finally ended somewhere safe. Nina closed her notebook. We'll sort the paperwork tomorrow, she said. Chuck nodded, but his eyes never left Pegasus. Because for the first time since the horse had entered his life, Chuck understood something he had missed before. The real race Pegasus had been running had never been on a track. It had been a long, quiet journey back to the only place that still felt like home. And tonight, he had finally found it. Morning arrived slowly over Mill Creek. The first light of dawn crept across the pasture like a quiet promise, touching the tops of the fence posts and the worn roof of the old barn. Mist hovered low over the grass. Somewhere beyond the fields, a rooster called out once, then again, as if announcing that the world had survived another night. Pegasus stood near the wooden fence, breathing softly into the cool air. For the first time since the chaos at the racetrack, there was no tension in his body, no restless shifting, no sharp flick of fear at distant sounds. He simply stood beside the pasture gate while Leslie brushed the dust from his coat with slow, patient strokes. Chuck watched from a few steps away. The scene felt strangely unfamiliar, not because of the farm, Farms looked like this everywhere. Weathered boards, uneven ground, fences repaired 100 times over the years. But the way Pegasus moved around Leslie was something Chuck had never witnessed before. The horse followed the rhythm of her hands, every motion calm, every breath steady. It was as if the animal had been carrying a knot deep inside him for years, and somehow, overnight, that knot had finally loosened. Deputy Nina Park leaned against the hood of her cruiser nearby, sipping coffee from a paper cup while watching the quiet reunion unfold. "You see it now," she said. Chuck nodded slowly. "Yes." Nina looked toward Pegasus. "Animals remember safety the same way people remember home." Chuck did not answer, because what he was feeling was heavier than agreement. It was realization. For months he had believed Pegasus's discipline came from training. Now he understood it had often come from endurance. Enduring noise, enduring pressure, enduring a life that had been built entirely around performance. Across the pasture, Leslie finished brushing Pegasus and rested her hand gently along the horse's neck. "Easy, boy," she murmured. Pegasus lowered his head slightly, the same quiet gesture Chuck had seen at the track. Recognition, trust, not ownership, trust. Chuck stepped closer. Leslie looked up when she heard his boots in the grass. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The early sunlight painted the pasture in pale gold, catching the dark shine of Pegasus's coat. The horse turned his head once toward Chuck, studying him calmly. Chuck swallowed. "I checked the records again this morning," he said. Leslie waited. "The registration Nina found, it's real." She nodded slowly. "I know." Chuck glanced at Pegasus. "He ran straight here." "Yes." "You didn't guide him?" Leslie shook her head gently. "No." Chuck looked across the open pasture. The racetrack suddenly felt very far away. "You said you ran after the trailer the day they took him." Leslie's fingers moved slowly through Pegasus's mane. "I did." "How old were you?" 10. Chuck took a long breath. "That must have been a long road." Leslie gave a small, sad smile. It was. Silence settled between them again. Then Chuck reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He held it for a moment before offering it to her. "What's that?" Leslie asked. "Transfer papers." Her expression tightened. "For what?" Chuck looked at Pegasus. "For him." Leslie didn't move. Chuck continued quietly. "Last night I kept thinking about something my father used to say." He paused. He believed horses remember the people who treat them like lives instead of investments. Leslie watched him carefully. Chuck exhaled. "I think Pegasus made his choice a long time ago." Leslie slowly took the paper. Her eyes moved across the page. Then she looked up again. "You're giving him back?" Chuck shook his head slightly. "No." He looked at Pegasus. "I'm giving him home." The words seemed to settle over the pasture like sunlight breaking through cloud. Pegasus lifted his head and stepped forward one pace, standing between them. Nina walked over, curiosity in her eyes. "Looks like paperwork morning started early," she said. Chuck gave a faint smile. "Figured we could skip the courtroom." Nina read the document briefly and nodded. "This makes the ownership joint until the registry review finishes." Leslie looked confused. "Joint?" Chuck nodded. "You keep the farm running." He glanced at Pegasus. "And I'll make sure no one ever tries turning him into a debt payment again." Leslie's eyes softened. "That's not what I expected." Chuck gave a quiet laugh. "It's not what I expected either." The three of them stood in the pasture as the morning light grew stronger. For the first time in years, Chuck felt something loosen inside his chest. Not victory. Something better. Peace. A few weeks later, the racetrack hosted an event unlike any it had ever seen. No betting booths, no sponsor banners, no announcers shouting odds. Instead, a small crowd gathered along the rails for a charity run organized by Deputy Nina Park and the county board. The event raised money for struggling farms and abandoned horses across the region. Pegasus entered the track again that afternoon. But everything about the moment was different. There was no whip, no pressure, no demand. Leslie rode him lightly, her posture relaxed, her hands resting low against the reins. Chuck stood near the rail watching. At the far side of the track, a sudden metallic clang echoed from a loose gate. For a fraction of a second, Pegasus stiffened. The old memory flickered. The old fear tried to return, but Leslie leaned forward and whispered softly into his ear. Pegasus exhaled. Then he ran, not because someone forced him, not because someone demanded a victory, but because the open track beneath his hooves finally felt like freedom. The crowd cheered, but Chuck barely heard them, because the greatest victory of that day had already happened. A frightened horse had found his way home, and a man who once believed success could only be measured in winnings had finally learned the truth. Some victories never sit on a trophy shelf. They breathe, they heal, and sometimes they run free.